Hello and welcome. My name is Risa Shaw.
And I'm Carla Mathers.
We're here today to talk with you about court interpreting, and specifically the physical positioning that a court interpreter can expect to take in the courtroom. In order to do that, we will first introduce the two most frequent roles that interpreters take in court.
Court interpreting is one of those specialty areas. In our field, we see the most highly skilled, educated, and trained sign language interpreters working in court. And for good reason. Court interpreting is an area in which the skills and knowledge of the court interpreter can frequently have a lasting impact on the deaf consumers. For obvious reasons, we would like to make sure that that impact is a positive one.
When a court calls for an interpreter, the court may not know anything more than the fact that they need interpreting services for a particular proceeding. It is up to the interpreter to know the questions that they need to ask in order to determine exactly which role the court needs them to take. It is our hope that this video will provide you with an overview regarding the roles and the physical positioning. Any interpreter who chooses to accept work in a courtroom needs this basic information in order to make a reasoned determination about working in court.
So let's begin. The role that the interpreter takes is frequently determined by the role the deaf person plays in the proceeding. We're going to begin the analysis with the most common role the interpreter is asked to play, the proceedings interpreter. The proceedings interpreter is defined as an officer of the court who interprets all of the proceedings and the witness testimony for the benefit of the participants and the court. Because American Sign Language is a visual language, the interpreter will have to be positioned within the sight line of the deaf person. In this first scene, notice that the proceedings interpreter is in the center of the courtroom facing the deaf litigant. The center of the courtroom is called the well. In matters in which a deaf person is a party, this is where the proceedings interpreter is positioned. Notice that there are two interpreters who are functioning as a team, just like interpreters do in other settings. The second interpreter is positioned near and slightly behind the deaf litigant and in the sightline of the proceedings interpreter. This allows for the team interpreter to be able to monitor the interpreter who's signing to the defendant. Generally, the interpreter is not going to be voicing from this position. However, if it becomes necessary for the interpreter to voice, the team interpreter would likely change positions. But more about that in a minute. For now, let's take a commonly encountered script and see how the positioning works.
Okay, I think we're ready to move on to selecting our jury, unless there are any other matters we need to consider before we begin voir dire. Counsel?
No, Your Honor. The state is ready as well, Your Honor.
Okay, then let's bring in our first group.
This is typically the position that the interpreter will take when hired to work with a deaf party. Now, if the judge were going to speak with the deaf defendant, say in a criminal matter, the proceedings interpreter would need to voice interpret. In that case, the team interpreter would need to reposition herself in order to provide adequate services.
A second role that interpreters take in court is what we call the counsel table interpreter. You will hear this role called by various names, such as the table interpreter, defense or plaintiff's interpreter, law office interpreter, party interpreter, or monitor interpreter. Though the name may change, the function and the definition of this role remains the same. The primary function of the counsel table interpreter is to interpret private conversations between the attorney and the client, and to monitor the proceedings interpreters for accurate interpretation. The interpreter at counsel table is a part of the litigation team and is responsible for interpreting the privileged attorney-client conversations before, during, and after the proceedings. This interpreter will sit at counsel table between the attorney and the deaf client in order to provide this function. Let's watch how the interpreter functions when the defendant wants to speak with the attorney during judge's instructions to the jury. Notice what the proceedings interpreters do during this exchange.
Counsel, I think we're ready to begin selecting our jury. Are there any other matters we need to take up before we move on to voir dire?
No, Your Honor. The defense is ready to proceed. The state is ready as well, Your Honor.
Okay, let's bring in the first group.
The counsel table interpreter also performs the essential function of monitoring the proceedings interpreter's interpretations for accuracy. The ability to monitor effectively is a highly specialized and advanced skill. Therefore, prior to accepting a legal assignment as the interpreter at counsel table, the interpreter must ensure that she or he possesses the skills necessary to carry out this function. We recommend that interpreters take specialized training in the mechanics of monitoring interpretations.
While the two previous scenes may be the most commonly occurring configurations that interpreters encounter in court, there are a variety of other situations that can also occur. Each one may require the services of a deaf interpreter. Remember that when the task requires 2 hearing interpreters, it will then require the same number of deaf interpreters to complete the deaf hearing team. Let's look at the previous scenarios with a team of deaf and hearing interpreters.
In this next scene, we will see how the positioning of the interpreters, as well as the sheer number of them, makes the proceedings more complicated. You will see that the deaf interpreter stands in front of the deaf defendant, while the hearing interpreter is positioned slightly behind the deaf defendant. Notice where their teammates place themselves so that they can both monitor and support the interpreters. It is important for the hearing interpreter to be out of the sight line of the deaf defendant so that the defendant is not distracted by the hearing interpreter's signing. Let's take a look at the positioning of a deaf hearing team signing to a deaf defendant during jury instructions and see how the positioning works.
Counsel, I think we're ready to select the jury. Are there any other matters that we need to attend to before we begin voir dire?
No, Your Honor, the defense is ready to begin. The state is ready to proceed as well, Your Honor.
Okay, let's bring in the first group.
You can see how crucial it is for the proceedings interpreters to adequately explain how the interpreting process will be managed in court. This can be done ahead of time. Often, a memo which includes a diagram will help to prepare the courtroom participants for what to expect in terms of how the interpreters need to position themselves in order to provide adequate interpreting services.
In the next scene, we look at the process when there's a deaf witness. The interpreting team must position themselves to both voice and sign for the witness. See how both proceedings interpreters are facing the deaf witness and can still easily monitor and support each other. Positioning is vitally important in order for interpreters to have a clear view of the witness's testimony. At the same time, the interpreters must be careful not to block the view of the witness by any of the jurors or parties. In discussing positioning with the parties ahead of time, it's always a good idea to reassure them that although the interpreters must have the flexibility to move around in the courtroom to optimally position themselves for communication, they will always attempt to avoid blocking the view of any of the other participants. Now, let's look at a common sample of direct examination to give you an idea of what we're talking about.
Good morning. Could you state your name, please?
It's Thomas Kwan,
And what is your address?
500 Kalmia Road.
Where are you currently employed?
At the Beltsville Hospital.
Please explain what it is that you do there.
I'm a radiologist.
Because courtrooms are configured differently with respect to size and shape, the proper positioning for an assignment can be very sensitive. Again, the interpreters need to be sure to discuss the positioning and to obtain agreement with the parties ahead of time.
In the next scene, we will watch the proceedings interpreters, a team that consists of 2 deaf interpreters and 2 hearing interpreters working with 1 deaf witness. Notice that the deaf interpreter still faces the witness, and the hearing interpreter takes her place slightly behind and to the side of the witness. The hearing interpreter must be able to see both the deaf witness's testimony and the deaf interpreter's interpretation. The hearing interpreter must be able to monitor her deaf colleague for accuracy. Likewise, the other 2 interpreters will also be monitoring the team for accuracy. The hearing interpreter will be voicing from the deaf interpreter's rendition of the testimony, not directly from the deaf witness. Let's see how this looks.
Good morning. Would you please state your name?
My name is Scott Hall.
And what is your address?
(3712) Main Street. Again, all four interpreters are functioning as one team. An issue that the interpreting team will have to discuss during their preparation is that of timing and consecutive interpretation. As you can see from the preceding scene, the length of time it takes to convey a message through a proceedings team of deaf and hearing interpreters is somewhat longer than with a team of just hearing interpreters. Also, in the previous example, there was only one deaf person involved, the witness. The situation becomes more complex, as we will see, when there is a deaf witness and a deaf defendant.
In the next scenario, notice that the interpreters must position themselves in order for the attorney's questions to be seen by both the deaf witness and the deaf party. In certain courtrooms, this can be tricky to do. Let's see how the interpreters in this scene were able to do it.
Good morning. Could you state your name, please?
Thomas Kwan.
And what is your address?
500 Kalmia Road.
Where are you currently employed?
I work for Beltsville Hospital.
One proceedings team can adequately provide services as long as they can be physically positioned in both deaf persons' sight lines, and as long as both deaf people use the same language. If, however, the deaf defendant uses American Sign Language and the witness uses an English-like signing, one set of interpreters would not be able to meet the linguistic needs of that assignment. In that case, it would be completely appropriate to hire a proceedings team who would simply interpret the witness testimony, and a separate proceedings team to interpret all of the proceedings to the defendant. A further advantage of having separate proceedings teams for the witness is that it would avoid the interpreter gymnastics that can occur in a courtroom that doesn't physically allow for interpreters to be clearly viewed by both the witness and the party.
In the next example, the deaf defendant and the deaf witness do not use the same language. As a result, two sets of proceedings interpreters are indicated. One team, consisting of deaf and hearing interpreters, works with the witness, while the other team of proceedings interpreters, two hearing interpreters, works with the deaf defendant.
Good morning. Would you please state your name?
My name is Scott Hall.
And what is your address?
(3712) Main Street. The deaf defendant will likely want to see how the deaf witness presents their testimony. So again, the positioning of the interpreters so as to not block the view of the deaf defendant and the deaf witness is vitally important.
Now, we're going to switch gears just a bit and demonstrate the positioning of the proceedings team when working with a deaf juror. Jurors are a critical part of the justice system, and now that deaf people are being called upon to participate in jury duty, more and more interpreters are being called upon to work in the specialized setting as well. The interpreter who interprets for jury duty remains in the role of the proceedings interpreter. Let's take a look at the physical positioning of the proceedings team when working with a deaf juror.
It's important to bear in mind that the interpreter is not a party in the case. doesn't have any interest in the case, the interpreter is not a witness, and the interpreter has a professional responsibility to remain completely neutral in these proceedings.